When the lamps along a Soviet avenue flickered on at dusk, they did more than illuminate pavement and tram rails. They marked the beginning of a different rhythm of life, one governed by schedules printed in factory bulletins, by the distant hum of centralized planning, and by the quiet, persistent understanding that daily existence was intertwined with a state that reached into kitchens, classrooms, and collective farms alike. To imagine life in the USSR is not to picture a single uniform experience stretched across 11 time zones, but rather a mosaic of routines, compromises, ambitions, shortages, solidarities, and quiet personal negotiations that unfolded from the Baltic coast to the Pacific steppe. A morning in a typical Soviet city apartment often began before sunrise, particularly in the decades after the Second World War, when urban populations swelled rapidly. Many families lived in communal apartments, kommunalkas, large pre-revolutionary flats divided into several living spaces, each assigned to a different household. The long corridor smelled faintly of boiled cabbage, laundry soap, and sometimes kerosene from portable stoves. Doors opened and closed in practiced sequence as neighbors timed their use of the shared kitchen. Each family might have a shelf in the refrigerator labeled with a surname, a small square of territory in an otherwise collective environment. Privacy was negotiated not through architecture, but through etiquette, a knock on the doorframe, a lowered voice, the unspoken rule that one did not linger over another family's simmering pot. Breakfast could be modest. Black bread was common, dense, dark, and sustaining. Butter, when available, was spread carefully to make it last. Tea poured from a metal kettle or brewed in a glass held by a decorative podstakannik provided warmth in both winter cold and summer heat. For some, kasha, porridge made from buckwheat or other grains, was a dependable staple. The contents of the table depended heavily on the time period and region. In some years, the shelves of state stores carried a predictable selection. In others, shortages made even basic items uncertain. People learned to adapt, to substitute, to preserve. Children prepared for school in uniforms that emphasized equality over individuality. The standard outfit, dark dresses with white aprons for girls, dark jackets and trousers for boys, was meant to signal belonging to a collective educational mission. Classrooms displayed portraits of leaders and slogans about diligence and patriotism. Lessons included mathematics, literature, science, and history, but also civic instruction about the achievements of socialism. Students memorized poetry, recited multiplication tables, and participated in organized youth movements like the Young Pioneers, where scarves of bright red cloth became a visible symbol of participation in a shared ideological journey. Adults often traveled to work using public transportation that formed the arteries of Soviet urban life. Trams rattled along steel tracks, buses groaned through winter slush, and in major cities, the metro served as both practical infrastructure and architectural statement. Stations were decorated with mosaics, chandeliers, and polished stone, designed to reflect a vision of progress accessible to ordinary citizens. Commuters stood shoulder to shoulder, reading newspapers folded into neat rectangles, their breath visible in winter as doors opened and closed at frequent intervals. Work itself was organized around state enterprises, factories, design bureaus, administrative offices, research institutes, collective farms, and construction brigades. The concept of guaranteed employment was a defining feature of the system. A worker might spend decades at the same plant, moving gradually from apprentice to skilled specialist. Production targets were posted on bulletin boards, sometimes accompanied by lists celebrating exemplary labor. Stakhanovite ideals, named after a miner famous for surpassing quotas, encouraged productivity framed as heroism. In practice, the rhythm of work varied. Some days involved intense effort to meet deadlines. Others were marked by waiting for materials delayed somewhere along a vast supply chain. Factories had their own microcultures. Break rooms offered tea, conversation, and sometimes debate conducted in cautious tones. Colleagues exchanged news about shortages, where oranges had appeared, which shop might receive a shipment of shoes. Informal networks became essential tools for navigating everyday needs. The phrase "blat" described a system of favors and personal connections that helped people secure goods or services that were technically available but not reliably distributed. A mechanic might help a neighbor repair a refrigerator. In return, the neighbor's cousin working at a store might set aside a scarce item. In rural regions, the cadence of life followed agricultural cycles shaped by collective and state farms. Fields stretched wide, dotted with machinery maintained by teams responsible for tractors and harvesters. Villages often retained older patterns of social life, extended families living nearby, shared labor during planting and harvest, seasonal celebrations rooted in both tradition and Soviet-era rituals. Collective farm workers received wages, sometimes supplemented by produce from small private plots. These household gardens, carefully tended strips of land, played a significant role in supplementing diets with potatoes, cabbage, onions, and other vegetables grown with patient attention. Housing construction during the post-war decades transformed city landscapes. Rows of standardized apartment blocks, often called khrushchevkas, rose quickly to address overcrowding. They were not luxurious, but they offered something many families had never previously enjoyed: a private kitchen, a bathroom, a separate living space. Thin walls carried the sounds of neighbors' radios and footsteps, yet the shift from communal apartments to individual flats represented a tangible improvement in daily comfort for millions. Furniture was functional, often produced by state factories with limited design variation. Bookshelves held volumes of classic literature, technical manuals, and sometimes collected works of Marxist theory distributed through workplaces. Shopping required patience and flexibility. State-run stores displayed goods behind glass counters, with clerks retrieving items upon request. Lines formed quickly when rumors spread about new deliveries. People learned to recognize the subtle signals: a truck unloading crates, a queue gathering outside a butcher shop before opening hours. Waiting became a shared social experience, with conversations flowing between strangers about recipes, weather, or workplace frustrations. Occasionally, a line ended with shelves already empty, prompting resigned shrugs and a plan to try another location. Clothing choices were shaped by availability rather than fast-changing fashion cycles. Durable coats, sturdy boots, and practical dresses were valued. Tailoring and home sewing played an important role in personalizing garments. Patterns circulated among friends. A skilled seamstress could transform limited materials into something distinctive. Imported items, when obtainable, were prized, sometimes treated with special care to extend their lifespan. Children's clothing was often handed down between siblings, patched at the knees and reinforced at elbows. Leisure time existed within both structured and informal frameworks. State-sponsored cultural institutions, libraries, theaters, cinemas, were widely accessible and often inexpensive. An evening at the cinema might feature newsreels before the main film, presenting curated glimpses of domestic achievements and international developments. Theaters staged classical works alongside contemporary productions. Libraries served as quiet refuges where readers could borrow novels, technical guides, or poetry. Reading held a particularly significant place in Soviet culture, offering both education and escape. At home, entertainment could be simple. Radios broadcast music, news, and serialized programs. Later, television sets, boxy and modest, became focal points in living rooms, drawing families together for scheduled broadcasts. Board games, chess matches, and card games filled long winter evenings. Visits between friends often involved tea, conversation, and shared dishes assembled from whatever ingredients were available. Hospitality remained a valued tradition, even when cupboards were not abundant. Vacations were structured around state-organized opportunities. Workers might receive vouchers to sanatoriums, rest facilities located near the sea, in forests, or in mountainous regions, where rest was combined with medical supervision. These stays included scheduled meals, walks, and therapeutic treatments. Children attended summer camps, the most famous being those associated with youth organizations, where days were filled with group activities, songs, and sports. Travel abroad was rare and tightly controlled, but travel within the vast territory of the USSR exposed citizens to different climates, landscapes, and regional cultures. Food culture balanced scarcity with creativity. Seasonal produce shaped menus. Preserving techniques, pickling cucumbers, fermenting cabbage into sauerkraut, bottling jams were widespread household skills. A well-stocked pantry of jars represented both security and pride. Celebratory meals during holidays featured more elaborate dishes, salads layered with mayonnaise, roasted meats when obtainable, and cakes assembled from carefully saved ingredients. New Year's Eve held particular importance as a festive moment marked by decorated trees, special foods, and televised addresses. Education beyond primary school opened pathways into specialized careers. Technical institutes trained engineers, doctors, teachers, and scientists. Admission could be competitive, influenced by academic performance and sometimes by social background or recommendations. Students often received stipends, modest but meaningful support that allowed them to focus on studies. Dormitory life introduced young adults to communal living once again. Shared rooms, late-night conversations, collective preparation for exams. Scientific and technological achievements were sources of national pride. News about space exploration, industrial expansion, and infrastructure projects circulated widely. Posters depicted cosmonauts, steel workers, and farmers as heroic figures contributing to a shared future. For many citizens, these achievements provided genuine inspiration, reinforcing a sense that their daily labor connected to larger historical momentum. At the same time, everyday life included subtle negotiations with bureaucracy. Forms were stamped, offices visited, permissions requested. The process of obtaining certain goods, cars, larger apartments, specialized equipment, could involve waiting lists stretching years. People learned which offices required which documents, which days were best for submitting applications, and how to navigate official channels with persistence. The language of paperwork, signatures, seals, and approvals became a familiar part of adulthood. Religion persisted in various forms despite official atheism. Some families quietly maintained traditions, celebrating holidays at home, visiting places of worship discreetly. Others embraced secular identities aligned with state ideology. Public expressions of faith were more visible in certain regions than others, reflecting the diversity of cultural histories across the Union. The coexistence of official narratives and private belief systems created a layered social landscape. Media consumption was shaped by state oversight. Newspapers emphasized achievements, policy announcements, and international developments framed through a particular lens. Citizens developed their own ways of interpreting information, reading between lines, comparing official reports with personal experience. Word of mouth remained an important channel for news about local events or practical matters. Healthcare was provided through a universal system that emphasized accessibility. Clinics and hospitals were widely distributed, though resources varied. Preventive care, vaccinations, routine checkups was encouraged. Sanatorium stays, as mentioned, blended rest with treatment. Medical professionals operated within the constraints of available equipment and supplies, often relying on ingenuity to address challenges. Seasonal changes profoundly shaped daily routines. Winters in many regions were long and severe, requiring heavy coats, insulated boots, and careful management of heating systems. Central heating systems, when functioning reliably, transformed apartments into warm refuges from snow-covered streets. Children built forts in courtyards, adults navigated icy sidewalks with practiced caution. Summers brought open windows, crowded beaches along rivers and seas, and opportunities to spend evenings outdoors in courtyards where neighbors gathered on benches. Music and the arts occupied a meaningful place in cultural life. Conservatories trained musicians who performed classical repertoires with high technical standards. Amateur ensembles flourished in workplaces and community centers. Folk traditions persisted alongside officially promoted compositions. Songs learned in childhood, at school, at camps, often remained embedded in memory for decades. The presence of the state was both visible and mundane. Official holidays marked anniversaries of historical events with parades, banners, and speeches. Participation ranged from enthusiastic to obligatory, depending on individual perspective. Marching bands, coordinated displays, and carefully arranged columns of workers created spectacles intended to symbolize unity. For some, these events were moments of genuine pride. For others, they were rituals to be completed before returning to private concerns. Family life balanced collective expectations with personal aspirations. Parents emphasized education and stability for their children, hoping to secure reliable futures. Grandparents often played active roles in childcare, passing down stories that blended pre-revolutionary memories with contemporary realities. Apartments, even when small, were arranged to accommodate multiple generations during visits. Photographs displayed on walls documented milestones, graduations, military service, weddings. Military service was a significant experience for many young men, introducing them to distant regions and diverse fellow citizens. The routine of barracks life, drills, maintenance tasks, shared meals, created bonds that sometimes endured long after discharge. Letters home carried descriptions of unfamiliar landscapes and requests for parcels containing favorite foods. Consumer goods, such as automobiles or electronics, represented major milestones when acquired. A car might be maintained meticulously, washed regularly, and used for family excursions to countryside dachas. Small seasonal cottages where urban residents grew vegetables, rested, and enjoyed relative independence from city schedules. Dacha life involved digging soil, repairing fences, sharing harvests with neighbors, and cooking outdoors during warm months. Language itself carried traces of collective identity. Phrases about comradeship, labor, and progress appeared in official discourse and everyday speech. Humor developed as a coping mechanism. Anecdotes and jokes circulated privately, offering relief from constraints without directly confronting authority. Laughter shared in kitchens or workshops became a subtle form of social bonding. As decades progressed, generational differences emerged. Those who remembered earlier hardships, war, Reconstruction, severe shortages, often evaluated conditions through a lens of improvement. Younger citizens, exposed to limited glimpses of life beyond Soviet borders through media or rare travel, sometimes measured their expectations differently. This evolving perspective influenced attitudes toward work, consumption, and the future. Evenings in Soviet apartment block might end quietly. The television signed off after scheduled programming. Street lights cast steady pools of light across courtyards where the last conversations faded. Inside, if you listened closely in the pre-dawn stillness of a Soviet neighborhood, before factory whistles cut through the cold air, you might hear the muffled thud of someone shaking out a rug over a balcony rail, or the hollow echo of footsteps in a stairwell that smelled faintly of coal dust and floor polish. Life in the USSR often unfolded through these small, almost invisible gestures, ordinary movements that, when repeated across millions of apartments, formed a quiet choreography of shared existence. The state was vast, its ambitions enormous, but the texture of daily living was built from routines as simple as boiling water, tying a scarf, and checking whether the bread shop had received its morning delivery. In many cities, stairwells were communal spaces in the fullest sense. Notices were pinned to corkboards announcing scheduled maintenance, lost keys, or meetings of residence committees. These committees, sometimes formal, sometimes loosely organized, played a role in managing shared responsibilities such as cleaning hallways or coordinating minor repairs. The building itself became a small ecosystem. Someone knew how to fix wiring. Another neighbor had access to spare paint. Someone else had a relative who worked in municipal services. The physical environment demanded cooperation, and that cooperation, though occasionally strained, created networks of familiarity that could last for decades. Inside apartments,
The arrangement of space reflected both necessity and careful planning. Furniture was positioned to maximize functionality. Folding tables expanded when guests arrived. Sofas doubled as beds. Cabinets stored not only dishes and linens, but also items saved just in case, a habit born from years when availability could not be assumed. A jar might hold extra screws. A box might contain spare buttons, carefully removed from worn clothing before it was discarded. The concept of waste was treated differently in a society where replacement was not always easy. Morning routines were structured around predictability. Radios turned on early, broadcasting news bulletins, followed by music or educational programming. The tone of these broadcasts was steady, formal, reassuring in its consistency. Families listened while preparing for the day. Children packed school satchels containing textbooks wrapped in protective covers to extend their lifespan. Parents checked watches, often mechanical, wound daily, before leaving for work. Timekeeping mattered, not only because of personal discipline, but because public systems, transport, factory shifts, office hours, operated according to synchronized schedules. In larger cities, the flow of commuters created a recognizable pulse. Platforms filled gradually, then emptied as trains arrived. The movement was efficient, practiced. People learned to stand in specific areas to align with carriage doors. Conversations were usually subdued during early hours, replaced by the rustle of newspaper pages or the faint squeal of wheels against rails. Even in crowded conditions, there existed a kind of mutual awareness, an understanding that everyone shared the same destination of work, study, or obligation.
Workplaces were not merely sites of production, but social environments shaped by collective identity. Bulletin boards displayed production statistics alongside announcements of birthdays, retirements, or upcoming cultural events. Portraits of exemplary workers, sometimes selected monthly, reinforced the idea that diligence was publicly recognized. Yet behind these displays existed the human dynamics found anywhere. Friendships formed over shared shifts, disagreements about responsibilities, quiet mentorship between experienced employees and newcomers learning specialized skills. In offices and factories alike, tea breaks were moments of pause that punctuated the workday. A thermos might be passed between colleagues. Sugar cubes, when available, were carefully rationed. Conversations ranged from technical matters to personal stories about children, housing applications, or plans for weekend excursions. Humor, often understated, circulated freely within trusted groups. The ability to laugh at minor inconveniences helped soften frustrations caused by bureaucratic delays or equipment shortages. Industrial environments carried their own sensory landscape. The rhythmic pounding of presses, the hiss of steam, the metallic scent of lubricants. These sounds and smells became familiar markers of daily life. Workers wore protective clothing that, though practical, often showed signs of repeated repair. Gloves were patched. Tools were maintained meticulously because replacements might not arrive quickly. Pride in craftsmanship coexisted with the awareness that resources were finite. In research institutes and technical design bureaus, the atmosphere differed but shared similar structural expectations. Engineers and scientists collaborated on projects ranging from infrastructure to aerospace. Chalkboards filled with equations were erased and rewritten repeatedly. Technical journals circulated among departments, sometimes months after publication. Discussions could be intense yet methodical, shaped by both genuine curiosity and the knowledge that outcomes contributed to national goals. Outside the workplace, lunchtime introduced another set of routines. Factory cafeterias, stolovias, served standardized meals designed to be filling and affordable. Trays moved along rails as patrons selected soup, bread, and a main dish. The menu might include borscht, cutlets, boiled potatoes, or cabbage-based salads. Food quality varied, but the availability of a hot meal during the workday was widely valued. Seating was communal, reinforcing the collective nature of the environment. In schools, midday breaks allowed students to eat simple meals provided on site or brought from home. Teachers supervised hallways while students exchanged stories, compared homework, or rehearsed songs learned in music class. Educational institutions emphasized group participation through organized activities, choirs, sports teams, science clubs that extended learning beyond textbooks. These programs aimed to cultivate both knowledge and social cohesion. Afternoons often brought administrative tasks that revealed the layered structure of governance. Citizens visited offices to register addresses, submit forms, or inquire about benefits. Waiting rooms contained rows of chairs and a window behind which clerks processed documents with careful attention to stamps and signatures. The pace could be slow, but the process followed established procedures that people gradually learned to navigate with patience. Housing allocation remained a significant concern for many families. Applying for a larger apartment involved demonstrating need, documenting household size, and waiting, sometimes for years. When approval finally arrived, the event carried emotional weight. Moving day involved friends and relatives helping transport furniture through narrow staircases, followed by a modest celebration in the new space. Even small improvements, an extra room, a balcony, represented meaningful progress. Markets operated alongside state stores in various forms. In some cities, open-air markets allowed individuals from rural areas to sell produce directly. These spaces were lively, filled with voices negotiating prices, examining the freshness of vegetables, or comparing the quality of homemade cheese. The contrast between standardized retail environments and these more dynamic marketplaces highlighted the diversity of economic interactions within the broader system. Food preparation at home required foresight. Ingredients acquired after waiting in line were rarely used impulsively. Meals were planned around what was available, often incorporating preserved items from previous seasons. The process of cooking could become a collaborative activity, one person chopping, another stirring, children setting the table. Evening's meals served as daily anchors, bringing households together to share both food and conversation. Conversations at the dinner table ranged widely. Parents asked about school progress, children described interactions with classmates, adults discussed workplace developments or upcoming obligations. Certain topics might be approached cautiously depending on context, but within trusted family circles, honesty was often valued. These moments allowed individuals to process the day's experiences collectively. After dinner, many households engaged in quiet activities. Homework occupied students for several hours. Adults might read newspapers, repair household items, or listen to music. The act of fixing rather than replacing was deeply ingrained. A malfunctioning appliance was opened, examined, and coaxed back into service whenever possible. Tools were kept organized in drawers or small boxes, reflecting both practicality and pride in self-sufficiency. Bookshelves served as intellectual landmarks within apartments. Collections often included classic Russian literature, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Pushkin, as well as translated works from other countries, technical manuals, and educational encyclopedias. Owning books carried cultural significance. They were displayed prominently, lent to friends, and sometimes annotated in margins. Reading provided both entertainment and a sense of continuity with broader historical traditions. Children's evenings sometimes included organized extracurricular sessions. Music lessons, sports practices, or youth club meetings extended beyond the school day. These environments reinforced discipline while offering opportunities for creativity. A child learning violin practiced scales repeatedly in a small room, the sound drifting through thin walls into neighboring apartments where listeners might recognize the melody from their own past. Outdoor spaces played an important role when weather permitted. Courtyards between apartment blocks functioned as shared gathering areas. Benches hosted conversations between older residents who exchanged observations about neighborhood changes. Children invented games using improvised equipment, sticks as goalposts, chalk markings on pavement. Teenagers gathered in small groups, discussing music, future careers, or plans for weekend outings. In winter, these same courtyards transformed into landscapes of snowbanks and icy paths. Residents cleared entrances with shovels stored in communal closets. Icicles formed along roof edges, occasionally knocked down to prevent hazards. The seasonal cycle demanded collective maintenance efforts that reinforced neighborly interaction. A shared task, clearing snow, often led to brief conversations that maintained social bonds. Transportation across longer distances revealed the vast scale of the country. Overnight trains connected cities separated by thousands of kilometers. Compartments held bunk beds, small tables, and samovars providing hot water. Passengers shared food, stories, and views through windows that shifted from forest to steppe to industrial outskirts. These journeys created temporary communities that dissolved upon arrival at distant stations. For those living near major rivers or coastal regions, water transport also played a role. Ferries and riverboats carried passengers and goods, linking settlements that might otherwise remain isolated. The slow pace of travel allowed time for reflection, conversation, or simply watching landscapes pass. Movement across geography emphasized both the enormity of the territory and the infrastructure designed to bind it together. Weekend routines often differed from weekday schedules. Saturday mornings might include errands, shopping, cleaning, laundry. Shared washing facilities in some buildings required coordination to avoid conflicts. Clothes were hung on balconies or communal lines, fluttering above courtyards like quiet signals of domestic activity. Afternoons were reserved for visits, friends dropping by with small gifts, relatives arriving with news from other districts. Hospitality carried expectations shaped by both tradition and circumstance. Hosts offered tea immediately, accompanied by whatever snacks were available: bread, jam, pickled vegetables, or occasionally sweets saved for special occasions. Guests reciprocated with conversation and, when possible, their own contributions. Even modest gatherings could extend for hours, sustained by storytelling and shared memory. Music often accompanied these visits. Someone might bring out a guitar, leading familiar songs that others joined. Lyrics passed orally across generations, creating a shared repertoire recognized across regions. The act of singing together reinforced a sense of belonging that transcended material limitations. Even those who did not sing listened attentively, tapping rhythms on tabletops. Cinemas provided another common leisure activity. Tickets were affordable, encouraging frequent attendance. Newsreels preceded feature films, presenting curated narratives of industrial progress, scientific discovery, or international solidarity. Feature presentations ranged from historical dramas to comedies. Audiences reacted collectively, laughter spreading through rows, quiet attention during serious scenes. The cinema hall became a temporary shared emotional space. Sports events also attracted spectators. Stadiums hosted football matches that generated enthusiastic crowds. Fans wore scarves or carried small banners, cheering teams representing their cities or workplaces. Participation in amateur sports, track, gymnastics, skating, was encouraged through workplace clubs and youth programs. Physical activity was framed not only as recreation, but as contribution to collective health. Seasonal holidays introduced rituals blending official ceremonies with family traditions. International Women's Day brought flowers and recognition from mothers, colleagues, and teachers. May Day featured parades with banners carried through city streets. Victory Day commemorations included veterans wearing medals, families attending memorials, and moments of reflection on shared history. Each holiday combined public symbolism with private meaning shaped by personal experience. Education about history emphasized narratives of struggle, resilience, and collective achievement. Museums displayed artifacts ranging from industrial equipment to wartime memorabilia. School excursions to these institutions provided tangible connections to lessons taught in classrooms. Students walked through exhibits while teachers explained context, encouraging reflection on a continuity between past sacrifices and present responsibilities.
Youth organizations structured much of childhood and adolescence. Meetings included group discussions, service projects, and ceremonial activities reinforcing shared values. Camps during summer months extended these experiences into natural settings, forests, lake shores, where days followed schedules balancing recreation with organized learning. Campfires, songs, and group competitions created memories that participants carried into adulthood. Urban infrastructure included cultural houses, multi-purpose centers hosting performances, lectures, and hobby groups. Residents attended dance classes, language courses, or craft workshops. These institutions functioned as accessible venues for creative expression, allowing individuals to develop interests outside professional obligations. Bulletin boards listed upcoming events, inviting participation. For many families, acquiring a television marked a significant milestone. Evening broadcasts structured schedules around specific programs, news, educational segments, variety shows. Neighbors without their own sets sometimes visited to watch together, creating small communal viewing experiences. The television's presence reshaped domestic routines, introducing shared moments of attention focused on a single screen. Technological devices were maintained carefully. Vacuum cleaners, radios, and record players were repaired repeatedly rather than discarded. Manuals were stored alongside warranty documents. Individuals with technical skills became valuable within their social networks, offering assistance that strengthened reciprocal relationships. This culture of maintenance extended the lifespan of household goods. In workplaces, recognition ceremonies acknowledged long service or exceptional performance. Certificates were presented during meetings, sometimes accompanied by modest bonuses or privileges. These acknowledgments reinforced institutional loyalty while also providing individuals with tangible evidence of their contributions. Certificates were often displayed at home, framed, or kept among important documents. Agricultural regions experienced distinct seasonal pressures. Spring planting required coordinated effort, with teams working extended hours to prepare fields. Summer involved maintenance, irrigation, and monitoring crop development. Autumn harvest brought intense activity as machinery operated continuously to gather produce before weather changed. Winter allowed for equipment repair, planning, and community events within village halls. Village life retained strong interpersonal familiarity. Residents knew each other's families across generations. Celebrations, weddings, births were communal affairs involving shared preparation of food and decorations. Traditional music and dance persisted alongside officially sanctioned festivities. Even as state structures influenced agricultural organization, local customs maintained continuity with earlier eras.
Healthcare facilities served both urban and rural populations, though access varied by location. Clinics provided routine care, vaccinations, and consultations. Larger hospitals handled complex cases. Medical personnel often worked long hours, balancing administrative requirements with patient needs. Preventative campaigns, encouraging hygiene, regular checkups, were promoted through posters and educational programs. Pharmacies dispensed medications produced through centralized distribution. Availability fluctuated, prompting individuals to seek alternatives or rely on home remedies passed through family knowledge. Herbal teas, compresses, and traditional practices complemented formal treatment, reflecting a pragmatic approach to maintaining health. Communication across distances relied heavily on postal services. Letters were written carefully, sometimes spanning several pages, describing everyday events in detail. Envelopes carried stamps featuring national symbols or commemorative designs. The arrival of mail was anticipated, particularly for families separated by work assignments or military service. Parcels containing food or handmade items reinforced emotional connections. Telephone access expanded gradually but was not universal in earlier decades. Public phone booths required coins or tokens. Conversations were often brief due to demand. Households fortunate enough to have a private line treated it as a valuable resource, used thoughtfully for essential communication. Scheduling calls in advance became common practice among relatives. Economic planning influenced the availability of consumer goods across years. Production quotas aimed to balance supply with anticipated demand, yet mismatches occurred. Citizens adapted through flexibility, purchasing items when available, even if immediate need was uncertain. Storage spaces, closets, under-bed compartments held reserves against future shortages. This behavior reflected rational planning within an unpredictable distribution environment. Educational curricula emphasized technical competence alongside ideological literacy. Students learned practical skills, drafting, laboratory techniques, preparing them for participation in industrial or scientific sectors. Field trips to factories or farms illustrated how classroom knowledge translated into real-world application. Career guidance often aligned individual aptitude with national priorities. Language diversity across the USSR created multilingual environments, particularly in regions with distinct cultural identities. Schools taught both Russian and local languages, though the balance varied. This linguistic landscape influenced literature, music, and everyday communication. Markets and public spaces echoed with multiple dialects, reflecting the Federation's complexity. Artistic expression operated within boundaries shaped by official expectations. Painters, writers, and filmmakers navigated guidelines while seeking creative authenticity. Some works celebrated industrial progress or historical heroism. Others explored personal themes through metaphor or subtle narrative choices. Audiences interpreted these works with varying perspectives, finding meaning beyond overt messages. Scientific achievements, especially in fields like space exploration, captured public imagination. Launch events were followed through broadcasts, classrooms discussed technological milestones, and children collected images of spacecraft. These accomplishments reinforced the idea that national effort could yield globally significant results, linking everyday labor with extraordinary outcomes. Consumer cooperatives occasionally supplemented state retail networks, allowing groups to organize distribution of specific goods. Members contributed labor or resources in exchange for improved access. These arrangements demonstrated the flexibility within the broader planned system, showing how localized initiatives addressed practical needs.
Environmental conditions influenced urban planning. In colder regions, buildings were designed to retain heat, with centralized systems distributing warmth through radiators. Maintenance crews monitored infrastructure to prevent outages during severe weather. Residents learned to adjust ventilation carefully, opening windows briefly to refresh air without losing accumulated heat. In warmer southern areas, daily rhythms shifted to accommodate higher temperatures. Early morning and evening became preferred times for outdoor activity. Markets opened before sunrise to avoid midday heat. Architectural features, such as shaded courtyards, provided relief, demonstrating adaptation to regional climates within the shared political framework. Cultural exchange within the USSR exposed citizens to diverse traditions. Traveling theater troupes performed in multiple republics. Music festivals showcased regional instruments and styles. These interactions fostered awareness of the Federation's breadth, even as centralized narratives emphasized unity. Individuals encountered cuisines, clothing, and customs different from their own, enriching social experience. Personal milestones, marriage, childbirth, were marked by both civil procedures and family celebration. Registry offices formalized unions with official documentation. Gatherings afterward included toasts, music, and carefully prepared meals.
Gifts were practical, household items, linens, reflecting the importance of establishing a stable domestic foundation. Financial transactions relied heavily on cash wages deposited through workplace systems. Savings accounts at state banks provided modest interest. Large purchases required planning, with funds accumulated gradually. The absence of widespread consumer credit shaped spending habits towards caution and long-term preparation. Education in the arts, music schools, drawing classes, was accessible to many children, cultivating technical skill from an early age. Public performances allowed students to present progress, building confidence. Parents attended these events with pride, reinforcing the value placed on cultural development alongside academic achievement. Libraries functioned as community anchors. Reading rooms offered quiet spaces for study. Librarians guided patrons toward recommended texts, maintaining catalog systems that organized extensive collections. Waiting lists sometimes formed for popular titles, encouraging anticipation and shared discussion among readers. Even late at night, certain workplaces continued operating. Power plants, transportation hubs, hospitals, these institutions required 24-hour staffing. Night shifts developed their own rhythms, with quieter corridors and a different cadence of tasks. Workers relied on strong tea and mutual support to maintain alertness during long hours. Over time, material conditions and expectations evolved. The introduction of new appliances, improved housing stock, and expanded educational opportunities altered daily routines, yet the underlying patterns, collective infrastructure, shared spaces, negotiated access to goods, remained consistent threads linking generations. Memory of earlier scarcity influenced how later improvements were perceived and valued. There were evenings across the Soviet Union when the air seemed to hold a patient stillness, as if the day's labor had settled into the walls of apartment blocks and factory halls alike. In those quiet intervals, after work shifts ended but before sleep claimed the city, one could sense how daily life was sustained less by grand declarations and more by countless habitual acts performed with practiced familiarity. The story of living in the USSR was often written not in speeches or slogans, but in the careful folding of laundry on a narrow balcony, in the steady turning of pages beneath a yellow reading lamp, in the gentle clatter of dishes washed by hand, because every item in the household had value and purpose.
For many urban residents, the structure of time itself was shaped by the predictability of scheduled obligations. Work shifts began at fixed hours, and lateness was discouraged not merely as a personal failing, but as a disruption to collective efficiency. Alarm clocks, mechanical and reliable, were wound before sleep to ensure the next morning would begin without delay. This relationship with time created routines that became almost instinctive. Even on days off, individuals often woke early out of habit, their internal rhythms aligned with years of structured schedules. In apartment kitchens, mornings often started with the soft rattle of spoons against enamel mugs. Tea remained a central presence in daily life, not simply as a beverage, but as a social ritual. Preparing tea required little equipment, a kettle, loose leaves or tea bags, hot water, but its significance extended beyond practicality. Sharing tea signaled hospitality, calm, and continuity. A visitor arriving unexpectedly would be offered a glass almost automatically, accompanied by whatever small snack could be found. These kitchens were rarely large, yet they carried immense symbolic weight. They were spaces of both nourishment and conversation. In homes where space was limited, the kitchen table functioned as dining area, workspace, homework station, and meeting place. Conversations held here often ranged more freely than in public settings. The familiarity of the environment allowed individuals to speak openly about personal concerns, future plans, or everyday frustrations. The design of many post-war apartment buildings emphasized efficiency over ornamentation. Hallways were narrow, staircases functional, and elevators, when present, often small enough that passengers stood shoulder to shoulder. Yet residents adapted these environments to reflect personal identity. Doorways were sometimes decorated with simple wreaths or nameplates. Inside, walls displayed photographs, embroidery, or framed certificates marking educational or professional achievements. In these living spaces, the radio continued to serve as a steady companion throughout the day. Broadcast schedules included news, music, educational segments, and cultural programming. The tone was measured, authoritative, and consistent across regions. Even when not actively listened to, the sound of voices emanating from a radio created a sense of connection to events beyond the immediate apartment walls. Children growing up in Soviet cities experienced a childhood structured by both institutional organization and informal neighborhood interaction. After school, many returned home to complete assignments that emphasized discipline and accuracy. Mathematics exercises were solved repeatedly to ensure mastery. Essays required careful handwriting and adherence to prescribed formats. Parents often supervised homework closely, viewing academic success as a pathway to future stability. Yet once tasks were completed, courtyards and nearby parks became extensions of home. Groups of children gathered to play games that required little equipment. Improvised sports, tag variations, and storytelling competitions filled long afternoons. These shared spaces allowed children from different families and backgrounds to interact regularly, forming friendships that sometimes persisted into adulthood. In smaller towns, the boundary between public and private life was even more permeable. Residents recognized one another easily on streets, in shops, and at local events. News traveled quickly through conversation rather than formal announcements. A new arrival to a neighborhood was noticed immediately, and introductions followed soon after. This familiarity fostered a sense of mutual awareness that could be comforting, but also meant that personal actions rarely went unnoticed. Shopping remained an activity shaped by planning and patience. Rather than spontaneous browsing, purchases were often guided by necessity and availability. Citizens learned to monitor delivery schedules and to recognize patterns in distribution. If a shipment of fresh produce arrived, word spread rapidly through informal networks. People adjusted their plans accordingly, sometimes interrupting other tasks to join a queue before supplies were exhausted. Queues themselves became social environments. Individuals waiting together for extended periods often engaged in conversation. Discussions covered topics ranging from cooking methods to local gossip. People occasionally held places in line for neighbors temporarily stepping away. These interactions created brief communities formed around shared purpose, dissolving once the line reached the counter. Clerks behind store counters performed transactions with deliberate care. Goods were often displayed separately from customers, requiring requests to retrieve items. This system emphasized accountability for inventory, but also slowed the pace of purchasing. Receipts were checked, items wrapped in paper or string, and change counted meticulously. Food preservation techniques were integral to household management. Glass jars lined shelves in kitchens and storage rooms, filled with pickled vegetables, jams, or preserved fruits. The process of preparing these stores often involved entire families. Summer and autumn were busy seasons for washing produce, sterilizing containers, and sealing lids. These efforts provided security during winter months when fresh items were less accessible. Meals varied by region and season, but certain staples appeared frequently. Soups were common, offering warmth and efficient use of available ingredients. Bread accompanied nearly every meal. Potatoes, cabbage, and grains formed the foundation of many dishes. When meat or fish was available, it was often prepared carefully to stretch portions across multiple servings. Holiday meals represented opportunities for greater abundance. Ingredients saved over time were combined into more elaborate dishes. Salads layered with vegetables and mayonnaise, baked goods assembled from limited sugar supplies, and carefully decorated cakes appeared on tables during celebrations. The preparation process itself became part of the holiday experience, with family members contributing specific tasks. Education remained central to the Soviet vision of societal development.
Schools emphasized both academic knowledge and collective responsibility. Students participated in cleaning classrooms, organizing materials, and assisting teachers with administrative tasks. These responsibilities were framed as contributions to a shared environment rather than chores imposed from above. Secondary education introduced specialization. Students with aptitude in mathematics or science might attend specialized schools focusing on technical subjects. Others pursued training in arts or vocational skills. The education system aimed to align individual abilities with national needs, guiding students towards careers where their contributions would be most effective.
University life offered new forms of independence. Dormitories housed students from diverse regions, creating environments where languages, customs, and experiences intersected. Shared living spaces required negotiation over schedules, cleanliness, and study habits. Late-night discussions in dorm rooms often explored philosophical questions, career ambitions, and interpretations of current events. Stipends provided modest financial support, but students frequently relied on careful budgeting. Cafeterias offered inexpensive meals, and libraries supplied textbooks to reduce personal expenses. Despite constraints, university years were often remembered as periods of intellectual growth and strong social connection. Work assignments after graduation were sometimes determined through centralized placement systems. New professionals relocated to cities or towns where their skills were required. This process expanded geographic mobility, exposing individuals to unfamiliar regions. It also meant adapting quickly to new workplaces and social networks. Industrial towns built around single enterprises developed distinct identities. The factory dominated both economic activity and community life. Housing, cultural centers, and recreational facilities were often tied directly to the enterprise. Workers shared not only employment, but also leisure spaces, reinforcing a strong sense of collective belonging. In these towns, shift changes altered the rhythm of daily activity. Streets filled briefly as one group of workers left and another arrived. Local shops adjusted hours to accommodate varying schedules. The constant hum of machinery served as a background presence even during off hours. Rural communities experienced different patterns. Agricultural work required flexibility in response to weather and crop cycles. Days began early during planting and harvest seasons, sometimes before sunrise. Evenings were spent maintaining equipment, preparing supplies, or participating in communal gatherings. Private household plots remained significant contributors to rural diets. Families cultivated vegetables, kept small livestock, and preserved surplus produce. These plots provided both nutritional and psychological benefits, offering a degree of autonomy within the collective agricultural structure. Seasonal festivals in rural areas combined official recognition with long-standing traditions. Music, dance, and shared meals reinforced community ties. Elders passed down stories about earlier generations, preserving cultural continuity even as broader political systems evolved. Healthcare services aimed to provide universal access. Clinics in both urban and rural areas offered preventative care, vaccinations, and treatment for common illnesses. Larger hospitals handled complex cases, often serving wide geographic regions. Medical professionals balanced heavy workloads with a commitment to patient care, shaped by training that emphasized public health. Pharmaceutical availability varied, encouraging the continued use of traditional remedies. Herbal infusions, compresses, and home-prepared treatments supplemented formal medicine. Families shared knowledge about effective methods, blending scientific and inherited practices.